PBS is planning to run a new documentary series this September on the Vietnam War, produced and directed by Ken Burns. Burns is a left-wing historian and documentary film producer with a history of having his politics shape the narrative of the story he is telling, with a number of resulting inaccuracies. Ken Burns correctly identifies the Vietnam War as being the point at which our society split into two diametrically opposed camps. He is also correct in identifying a need for us to discuss this aspect of our history in a civil and reflective manner. The problem is that the radical political and cultural divisions of that war have created alternate perceptions of reality, if not alternate universes of discourse. The myths and propaganda of each side make rational discourse based on intellectual honesty and goodwill difficult or impossible. The smoothly impressive visual story Burns will undoubtedly deliver will likely increase that difficulty. He has done many popular works in the past, some of which have been seriously criticized for inaccuracies and significant omissions. But we welcome the chance that this might be a balanced treatment of the full history of that conflict. We can only wait and see and watch closely when it goes public. The term Vietnam War itself, although accepted in common parlance, would more accurately be called the American phase of the Second Indochina War, that is from 1965 to 1973. The U.S. strategic objectives in Vietnam must also be accurately defined. There were two interrelated goals. The first was to counter the Soviet and Red Chinese strategy of fostering and supporting wars of national liberation, that is, violent communist takeovers, in third world nations. And the second, to defend the government of the Republic of South Vietnam from the military aggression directed by its communist neighbor, the Democratic Republic of North Vietnam. The arguments offered by the so-called anti-war movement in the United States were predominantly derived from communist propaganda. Most of them have been discredited by subsequent information, but they still influence the debates. They include the non-factual claims that the war in South Vietnam was an indigenous civil war, that the U.S. effort in South Vietnam was a form of neo-colonialism, and the real U.S. objective in South Vietnam was the economic exploitation of the region. The anti-war movement was not all monolithic. Supporters covered a wide range, from total pacifist Quakers at one end to passionate supporters of communism at the other. There were many idealists in it who thought the war was unjust and our conduct of the war was objectionable, as well as students who were terrified of the draft, and some who just found it the cause of the day. But some of the primary figures leading the movement were not so much opposed to the war as they were in favor of Hanoi succeeding in the war it had started. The key question is whether the U.S. opposition to communism during the Cold War from 1947 to 1989 was justifiable. The answer is that communism, Marxism, on a national level is a utopian ideal that can function only with the enforcement of a police state, Leninism, or a genocidal criminal regime, Stalinism. It always requires an external enemy to justify the continuous hardships and repression of its population, and always claims that its internationalist duty is to spread communism. When the Communist Party established the Vietnam Communist Party in 1930, there was no intention of limiting its expansionist ambitions to Vietnam, and they subsequently changed the name to the Indo-Chinese Communist Party at the request of the Comintern in Moscow. The people of Vietnam today live in one of the most corrupt and despotic regimes in the world, with one of the worst records in upholding basic human rights, as documented by several international agencies. Laos and Cambodia are vassal states of Vietnam, and Hanoi has many powerful agents in each, with enormous influence on events there. When the tanks of the North Vietnamese army rolled into Saigon in 1975, the anti-war movement congratulated itself on facilitating that victory. In the U.S. cultural media and academia, that same self-congratulatory mentality is reinforced, despite the fact that more people were killed in the 10 years following the North Vietnamese takeover of South Vietnam than in the previous 15 years of war. Infant and maternal mortality doubled under communist rule, and well over 1 million people went into concentration camps, some for up to 18 years. Under the Saigon government, despite corruption and favoritism, there was a free press with many publications thriving. All that stopped dead in 1975. Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden both expressed their belief that if the diminutive Vietnamese could defeat the Americans, they could do so as well. The anti-war faction should take responsibility for the wars we have had to fight since Vietnam because of their encouragement of our enemies. There's a profound difference between being defeated and forfeiting a game. This is what happened after Kissinger brought back a less than ideal but politically acceptable peace accord in 1973. It was fundamentally flawed in several ways, such as allowing 150,000 North Vietnamese Army troops to remain in South Vietnamese territory. But its main valid points were the promise of the North never to invade the South and the promise of the USA to support the South as needed to offset communist strengths. In 1972, the North Vietnamese trashed their promise and invaded with multiple divisions in fully conventional warfare, and the USA kept its promise by supplying the air power that gave ARVN an even chance to defeat the invaders, which they did in larger battles than any fought by the U.S. forces. Vietnamization had worked. But then Congress undermined the agreement by cutting the replacement material promised to our ally and codified in the agreement. That same Congress further nullified the accords by forbidding the use of any U.S. air power to punish the egregious North Vietnamese violations of the agreement. Those members of Congress should have known what the result of their actions would be, but they never acknowledged it. Thus, the North Vietnamese leader boasted that Americans will not come back now, even if we offer them candy. With massive support from Moscow and 2 years of detailed preparations, the fate of South Vietnam was sealed. Historians and serious reviewers of Burns' narrative should study the factual history of the Second Indochina War to detect any misleading implications and factual omissions that may be found in his visual narrative. PBS would do well to offer more than a token effort to promote Burns' wish for open discourse on this important and extremely relevant subject. Thank you.